The millionaire tossed money at the guardsman's feet, convinced that power and status gave him the right to humiliate anyone. But as he took a step forward, the entire world seemed to freeze. No one expected how this day would unfold. London, Buckingham Palace. The morning was clear and cloudless, one of those rare days when the sun wasn't hidden behind gray skies, its rays playing softly on the historic facades of the royal residence. The air carried the aroma of fresh coffee from nearby cafes, mixed with the sweet scent of hot waffles being sold at the corner of the square. As always, tourists gathered around the palace, standing behind barriers, snapping photos, taking selfies against the backdrop of the motionless guards in their immaculate red uniforms. For some, it was entertainment. For others, a chance to witness a tradition that had endured for centuries. But for Sergeant Tom Harris, it was just another day on duty. He stood at his post, as he had countless times before. Endurance, discipline, immobility, these were drilled into him through years of training. A guardsman was not allowed to blink, turn his head, or show the slightest emotion. He was a symbol of resilience, tradition, and the unwavering strength of Britain. Yet, as always, there were those in the crowd who saw things differently. A man emerged, weaving through the sea of tourists. An expensive suit, gleaming watch, a glass of something strong in his hand. His confidence oozed from every movement, his posture relaxed. The type of person who was used to buying anything he wanted. A typical guest of the capital, believing that spending money on a trip entitled him to do whatever he pleased. The crowd instinctively parted for him, as if giving him the stage. He smirked, scanning the spectators before his gaze settled on Harris. It was the smirk of a man who thought himself the smartest person in the room, someone who believed that the soldier before him was merely a decorative piece, standing there purely for his amusement. And that's when the circus began. "Well, well, let's see if he's real or not," he announced loudly, ensuring the crowd could hear. He took a step closer, raised his glass to his lips, and took a long sip. Some tourists giggled, sensing an impending spectacle. He stopped right in front of Harris, so close that the scent of expensive whiskey and cigars clung to the air between them. "Hey, buddy, you even alive?" he drawled with fake astonishment, leaning in. The guardsman remained still. No matter how much irritation boiled inside him, no matter how much he wanted to shove this man aside with a single move, he wasn't allowed to react. But the millionaire didn't understand that. His smirk widened as he pulled a few banknotes from his pocket and dramatically tossed them into the air. The bills fluttered down, landing at Harris's feet. "What about this? Will you smile for a tip?" The crowd gasped. Now it wasn't just rudeness, not just a joke. This was a slap in the face to tradition, a mockery of those who had served in that uniform for centuries, of those who had stood at their posts with honor, who had fought in battles, and whose legacy was now being trampled on, laughed at, as money was thrown at them like a trained monkey. Harris didn't flinch. Not a single muscle on his face betrayed a reaction, but something in his gaze turned colder. The millionaire basked in the attention. He looked around, seeking approval, laughter, validation. He loved being the center of the stage. But the crowd wasn't entirely amused. A young woman with a camera frowned. An elderly man in a hat pressed his lips together. Several people exchanged glances. Some even turned away, unwilling to partake in this spectacle. But the millionaire didn't care. He saw no boundaries, felt no shame. He took another step forward, and then he reached out his hand toward Harris's bearskin hat, and that's when he crossed the line. A sharp movement, a single step forward, a loud, commanding voice cutting through the air. "Step behind the white line, immediately." The crowd froze. The millionaire recoiled, startled that the motionless statue had suddenly come to life, and at that moment, everything changed. This was no longer a joke. This was a mistake, one he wouldn't be able to erase. The crowd remained tense after Harris's sudden movement. One step, one sharp, unmistakable warning, and the drunken millionaire no longer looked as confident as he had a minute ago. He wasn't used to being refused. He wasn't used to being put in his place. But leaving now would mean admitting defeat, and he couldn't allow that. So, like all people whose ego is bruised, he doubled down. Taking a deep breath, he forced a smirk, straightened up, and turned back to the crowd. He couldn't let himself look weak in front of an audience. Just a little longer, and he'd regain control. "Oh, so he can move!" he exclaimed loudly, hoping to ignite laughter. His voice rang with forced confidence, but his eyes flickered with irritation. The problem? Hardly anyone laughed. A few people chuckled nervously. But most? They remained silent. Even those who had been eagerly filming earlier now looked different. Something in the air had shifted. This was no longer a playful scene. This was ugly. The millionaire sensed it but refused to acknowledge it. He glanced down at the money on the pavement, the same bills he had thrown. They still lay there, untouched. No one from the crowd had even thought about picking them up. The situation was slipping from his grasp, and so he pushed further. "Let's take a picture, buddy," he declared, overly cheerful. He turned, pressing his shoulder against Harris, grinning in a mocking pose. Click. Cameras in the crowd captured the moment. A few nervous laughs sounded. But this time, it wasn't the same laughter as before. This time it was uneasy. People glanced at each other, and in their eyes there was something new. Disdain. This wasn't just a tourist's silly stunt anymore. This was disrespect. And then his gaze fell on Harris's horse. The powerful, majestic animal stood beside him, its coat gleaming in the sunlight. And in that moment, he made his final mistake. He stepped toward it. The crowd stirred. "He's not serious, is he?" "What an idiot." And then Harris moved again. His boots struck the pavement with force. His voice thundered, "Step away from the horse!" The crowd gasped. And the millionaire? His arrogance shattered, and for the first time in his life he felt it. Shame. The crowd was silent. Just moments ago, the square was filled with the lively chatter of tourists, cameras clicking, laughter echoing, people animatedly discussing the sights around them. But now, they all stood frozen, transfixed by what was unfolding before them. Even the air itself seemed heavier, denser. Millionaire Caulfield stood at the center of the tense circle, still struggling to process what had just happened. A minute ago, he had owned this moment, laughing, self-assured, a glass of whiskey in hand, reveling in the attention of the crowd. He had joked, tossed money, mocked the guardsman, believing it was all just entertainment. But then something shifted. Sergeant Harris moved. One sharp, precise step forward, and Caulfield lost his balance, nearly stumbling backward. He hadn't expected that. He was used to people playing along, laughing at his antics, never daring to challenge him. But this man was different. And now, all of the crowd's attention was no longer on Caulfield. It had shifted to the figure that had stepped forward. An elderly man, not tall, but commanding respect. His posture was straight, his steps firm. Old military medals gleamed on his chest, their worn edges proof of battles long past. He moved slowly but deliberately, with such quiet confidence that Caulfield involuntarily stepped back. The crowd reacted instantly. People began whispering, some raising their phones to record the scene. But the veteran paid no attention to them. His gaze was locked on Caulfield, and in that gaze there was everything: judgment, disappointment, cold contempt. Caulfield felt a sudden urge to look away, to escape that stare. He could handle media scandals, online mockery, even rival business tycoons trying to take him down. But this was different. This was the gaze of a man who had seen real life, who knew what duty, honor, and discipline truly meant. And he was looking at Caulfield as if he were nothing but filth on the pavement. The crowd was no longer laughing. The humor had died instantly. No one smiled. No one encouraged the spectacle anymore. Everyone understood. This moment was no longer about entertainment. Caulfield swallowed hard, glancing around. Only now did he notice the change in people's faces. Just minutes ago, they had been neutral, amused, entertained. Now, in their eyes, he saw something entirely different. Disappointment. Disgust. Some women shook their heads. A man holding a camera lowered it, as if no longer wanting to record what was happening. A few people exchanged hushed words, but this time it wasn't laughter. It was a murmur of disapproval. Caulfield felt uneasy. He was used to admiration, applause, and submission. He was used to money solving everything. That wherever he went, doors opened, people smiled, eager to accommodate his every whim. But now, standing before him, was a man who didn't care about his money or his status. The veteran shifted his gaze to Harris. For a few seconds, he silently assessed him. Then he turned back to Caulfield and spoke a single word. Disgrace. And that was enough. That word hit harder than any scandal, harder than any public humiliation. The crowd seemed to wake up. Someone let out a sharp scoff. A woman with a camera shook her head and turned away. Caulfield felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, to brush it off as a joke. But suddenly, he realized, any words would be meaningless. Now, he looked pathetic. No longer a millionaire, no longer a powerful businessman, no longer in control. Now, he was just a drunken fool who had gone too far. And nothing he said would change that. The crowd stood still, as if holding its breath. A moment ago, this had been a cheap tourist spectacle, a ridiculous circus put on for the amusement of onlookers. But now something else filled the air, something heavy, undeniable. Millionaire Caulfield remained frozen in place, still clutching his glass of whiskey. A minute ago, he had felt untouchable, convinced he was in control of the situation. But now he felt it slipping away. The laughter was gone. The curious glances had turned into silent condemnation. No one found his antics funny anymore. His eyes flicked to the scattered banknotes on the ground. The very money he had thrown at Harris in mockery, lying there unclaimed on the pavement. Once those bills had been a symbol of his power. Now they were a symbol of his humiliation. No one dared touch them. They were now worthless in the eyes of the crowd. When he had arrived in London, he had felt like a king. Money had opened every door. Staff had bowed their heads. His every demand had been fulfilled instantly. In his world, everything had a price. He had believed that his wealth didn't just pay for hotels and fine dining, but for the right to behave however he pleased. But now, standing before him was a man who could not be bought. Sergeant Harris. His unmoving silhouette seemed carved from stone. He didn't even look directly at Caulfield, but his presence alone was enough to drown out all the noise. Caulfield felt a sudden discomfort. He wanted to say something, to explain, to pretend it was all just a joke, but he knew any excuse would only make it worse. And then, that voice again, calm, firm, like steel. Disgrace. Caulfield spun around. The elderly man stood there, unchanged, not tall but commanding, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, the faded medals on his chest still gleaming under the morning sun. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to wave his arms. That one word carried more weight than any lecture or punishment. The crowd seemed to exhale all at once, as if finally acknowledging his presence. People exchanged glances. Some stepped forward. Others stared at Caulfield with open contempt. Usually, in every crowd, there are some who enjoy such disruptions, who laugh and egg them on. But not now. No one stood with Caulfield. Everyone was against him. Someone whispered harshly, "Unbelievable." Caulfield looked around, and for the first time, he realized he was alone. The same people who had cheered him on moments ago now refused to meet his eyes. They didn't want to be associated with him anymore. He no longer controlled the moment. A wave of heat surged through him. His once perfectly tailored jacket now felt tight, suffocating. The air was thick, the murmurs around him pressing down like a heavy weight. He swallowed hard. His first instinct? To fight back. To throw out some cutting remark, to regain control. But then, he looked at Harris, still unmoving, still undefeated. Caulfield knew he had lost, and he needed to leave. Now. He turned sharply and walked away. The crowd parted for him, but no one pretended nothing had happened. They watched him go, and in their eyes, not sympathy, not understanding, only contempt. And behind them, Sergeant Harris stood firm, unshaken, as steadfast as Britain itself. Millionaire Caulfield thought the incident would quickly be forgotten. After all, how many tourists misbehave? So he had a bit too much to drink, made some inappropriate jokes, and maybe crossed the line a little. So what? It would all disappear in the endless stream of daily news. But he was wrong. The internet was merciless. The video, where he threw money at the guardsman, where he tried to touch his hat, where he ultimately backed away in disgrace under the judgmental eyes of the crowd, spread across social media at lightning speed. Millions of views, thousands of comments, hundreds of articles. The journalists didn't even need encouragement. They tore him apart. Every second of the video was analyzed, scrutinized, dissected. Online commentators competed to be the most savage. Money can't buy you respect, buddy. This isn't a nightclub where you can throw cash at waitresses. That guardsman did more than the whole internet has in the last 10 years. He reminded everyone that dignity isn't for sale. This is what happens when you think the world is your playground. Reality steps in and puts you in your place. Caulfield's company tried to distance itself as quickly as possible. The official statement read, "Mr. Caulfield's actions and opinions do not reflect the values of our organization." Translation: We don't know this clown. His company's stock price plummeted. Investors pulled out of deals. Business partners avoided him. Thousands of emails flooded his office, demanding his resignation, calling for an investigation, demanding accountability. Caulfield had never seen anything like this. He was used to money buying influence, to problems being swept under the rug, to redirecting public attention elsewhere when necessary. But this time, money didn't help. He tried to defend himself. First, through his PR team, which called it a bad joke. Then, in an interview where he claimed he never meant to offend anyone. But the more he spoke, the more people despised him. Every excuse made him look pathetic. So he tried something else. He disappeared. For a few days, Caulfield vanished. No public appearances, deleted his social media, canceled meetings. But hiding was impossible. Journalists camped outside his house. The news wouldn't die down. Every move he made was discussed as if he were a criminal. And it wasn't just his reputation that was destroyed. Friends stopped calling. Business partners avoided him. Even waiters in his favorite restaurants looked at him with quiet contempt. He couldn't believe it had all started with one moment, when he threw money at a guardsman's feet. Now, those same bills had become the symbol of his downfall. And the worst part? He realized that nothing could change it now. A week passed. What Caulfield had initially dismissed as a trivial mistake had turned into a full-blown disaster. His name dominated headlines. His infamous video racked up millions of views, and social media burned with outrage. Public opinion was merciless. People weren't just criticizing him, they were boycotting his business, mocking him, calling for his downfall. His company tried to salvage its image, releasing a public statement condemning his actions and suspending him from his position. Stock prices crashed. Former business partners cut ties. Caulfield, once a powerful, untouchable man, was now a public disgrace. He had tried to explain himself. First, he claimed he was misunderstood, that it was just a joke. But the more he talked, the deeper he dug his own grave. People weren't willing to forgive. And then came the ultimate humiliation. His advisors pushed him to publicly apologize, not through a press release, not through an interview. He needed to return to Buckingham Palace, in person, and apologize in front of the public. And so, here he was, the same courtyard, the same guards, the same tourists. But now, he was no longer the arrogant millionaire with a whiskey glass. He stood there in a formal suit, his face tight with tension, his movements stiff with nerves. In his hand, he clutched a sheet of paper with a prepared speech of apology. People recognized him. They whispered. Some pulled out their phones, ready to record a different kind of show this time. Caulfield took a deep breath. He had to do this. He cleared his throat, lifted his gaze, and opened his mouth to read his apology. And then he saw him, Sergeant Harris, standing at his post, just as he had that day, just as unshaken, just as unmoving. While Caulfield's life had collapsed, this man had simply continued his duty. He had never sought recognition, never needed an audience, never needed to explain himself. He was just doing his job, and in that moment, Caulfield froze. He stared at the guardsman and felt for the first time just how absurd everything had been. His expensive suit, the scripted apology in his hand, the cameras waiting to capture his humiliation. It was all meaningless. Harris stood there, silent, still, unwavering. And yet, in his silence, there was more weight than in any speech. Caulfield swallowed hard. Slowly he lowered the paper. Then, without a word, he crumpled it in his fist. The words he had prepared suddenly felt empty. The only thing he could do was nod. A small gesture, barely noticeable. Harris didn't respond. He only slightly lifted his chin, the smallest acknowledgement. But Caulfield understood. He turned and walked away, feeling the weight of 100 silent eyes on his back. The crowd didn't applaud. No one called out after him. But he knew. It was over. The scandal faded over time, but never truly disappeared. The video of Caulfield's disgrace continued to circulate, accumulating more views, more memes, more discussions. It was no longer just about him. It had become a symbol of arrogance meeting reality, a symbol of the consequences of entitlement. His company never recovered. Under public pressure, the board of directors forced him to resign. Translation: they threw him out like a toxic asset. For a man who had controlled people's lives, this was the ultimate defeat. He was no longer invited to exclusive events. No more interviews, no more influence. He became the embodiment of everything society rejected. And what angered him most? Not the fall from power, not the mockery, not even the loss of wealth. What enraged him most was that it had all happened because of one silent guardsman, a man who had refused to react, a man who had remained unbroken. And only too late, Caulfield understood the truth. True power isn't in money, status, or control. It's in resilience. And that was something he never had.